It is the Awesemo MLB Live Before Lock show, sponsored by Jockmark. And by the way, Jordan, you have to get like a lamp or something. I can't see your fingers when you count down from there. It's so dark. It's so dark where you are. I'm kind of guessing like I'm counting five in my head. I'm like, I guess this is five. It's time to start. But that aside, football season is underway, but we've also got the baseball slates, a few of them left, and certainly probably going to be a little bit smaller size going forward. But maybe a little bit of an edge to be gained also, a little bit of public money, potentially playing football that just jumped into baseball, not really knowing what they're doing. But other than that, Adam, how did opening week of football go for you?
Actually went pretty well. Did well in cash for the most part. Lost some back in tournaments, but then made enough on Showdown last night that I came out ahead. So that was nice, especially since, I didn't have any good tournament results. So always feels good to get a little bit of money back.
Yeah, that was pretty much the same for me. And I joked about it early in the morning too, when the slate was about to start. Like, all right, well, 5 minutes after the slate ends, we're going to start building our showdown lineups, which is basically exactly what happened to me. I did terribly on the main slate. And then I had like the three best lineups on Yahoo last night for the single game slate, and then just made up for the entire day. So kind of like foretold it a little bit with the tweeting, but then also the baseball slate basically non-existent now on Sundays. So I didn't play. Did you play the MLB main slate yesterday?
No, I thought about registering it, but then I realized I was going to run short on time with NFL. So with like 10 minutes to go for NFL, I still hadn't entered a single lineup on any of the three sites that I was playing. So I'm really glad that I didn't try and also play baseball.
Yeah, well, we've got baseball to start now, and a more significant size slate. And I was actually a little happy to see that baseball didn't totally get nerfed tonight, even with Monday Night Football going on. So there are some decent contests. There's the $150,000 contest on DK with $50K to first. And right away, starting with the pitchers, I want to know what you make of Yu Darvish today, because I have had such a difficult time reading him in the second half of the season. In general, he's just been bad. He still generates swing and misses, though. Pitching is kind of thin at the top today. And the matchup, obviously, San Francisco is far from ideal, but relative to the other options, how are you handling Darvish? Because he's the guy who I have the most uncertainty about.
Yeah, I think there's a few guys that I feel kind of similarly on Darvish, but so I'm not concerned about him in terms of the results that we've had recently. I am concerned just because he's facing the Giants, and I think it's a tough matchup. So there's a few pitchers that I think are good, Darvish being one of them, where I'm going to be really interested in what the ownership looks like, trying to get the top pitchers tool pulled up now. Still had NFL stuff up, and that's not very useful for the show. But right now, 20% ownership going to him, 24.5% chance of being a top pitcher. I included a lot of stats about Darvish in the deep dive article today. And I mentioned it last time he pitched too. So the fact he's coming off of a good start against the Angels doesn't really do anything, because the Angels suck and the Giants obviously are a lot more dangerous offense. But even going into that Angel start, I kind of thought that Darvish's struggles were being overstated. Over his last 5 starts now, he's allowed a 354, or sorry, last 10 starts. He's allowed a 354 WOBA, 2.3 home runs per 9. He has a 6.84 ERA. That's obviously what people are talking about a lot, and it's why, they don't trust Darvish and all of that. But over those same 10 starts, he's only allowed a 277 expected WOBA. So that's like 80 points lower than his actual WOBA allowed. He has a 3.53 xFIP. So that's over 3 runs better than his ERA. He's allowed, he has a 22.4% home run per fly ball percentage in those 10 starts. For his career, he only has a 13.6% home run per fly ball percentage. So he's running really bad on fly balls. He still struck out 27.3% of hitters. He's only walking 4.6% over those 10 starts. I can't really find anything that points to Darvish actually being bad. I think, maybe his command isn't as great, and, maybe he's not pitching quite as well as he was earlier in the year, but I really don't think there's any glaring weaknesses for him here. I think it's a lot of bad luck. I think that you've seen the salary drop a bit to where I'm still interested in going there on a 7-game slate where there's a lot of risk in most of the pitching, especially if he's only going to pull about 20% ownership, because I do think he's one of the most talented and one of the highest upside pitchers on the slate.
Yeah, we've seen his top pitcher odds come up throughout the day. Earlier in the day when I did the strategy show with Eric, Yu Darvish was, I think, third, maybe. I remember Alek Manoah had the number 1 overall top pitcher odds on DK. Now Darvish is 1, Sandy Alcantara is 2, and Alek Manoah has dropped to 3. Also, Darvish's ownership has come down a little bit now at 22.4%, which, to your point, at least relative to our top pitchers tool, that does imply that Yu Darvish is slightly underowned. And, I just look at some of the other options here also, and something else that gets to him, despite some of the recent earned run struggles and the matchup, is I kind of have concerns about a lot of these guys at the high end. And one of the guys for sure is Clayton Kershaw, who, I mean, I guess we have projected well, but like, how deep do you think he's going in the game? Because I don't know that he's going to pitch deep enough to really warrant having exposure to him at his price point.
Yeah, my expectation, there's the blurb on DraftKings says that he's expected to go like 60 pitches, 4 innings. I'm not sure if that is based on an actual report or if that is speculation, but either way, it makes sense to me because he threw 49 pitches in his rehab start. Then he threw a bullpen. I'd be pretty surprised if he's going, even if it's more than 60 pitches, let's say 70, 75, even that at $10,400 is a pretty tough sell for me. I'd be surprised if you're getting more than that. I wouldn't be surprised at all if it really is 60 or 65.
I think Dave Roberts said they were expecting him to throw 60 pitches, if I remember correctly. So I would consider that to be, pretty reliable. And the other thing also was, like, what do the Dodgers even care? Like, there was a point in time where I forgot Kershaw was on the Dodgers. That's how loaded their team is. I was talking about the rotation, their playoff prospects with one of my friends, and just like how big of favorites they should be heading into the playoffs in terms of not like minus odds favorites, but what the fair odds were for them to win the World Series this year. And I forgot they have Kershaw in the rotation. Like, that's how ridiculous this team is. And the reason that I'm bringing that up and the relevance here is they don't need to pitch Kershaw right now. They've just kind of been saving him for the playoffs. I think these are warm-up starts for him as they get prepared for the playoffs. So I would be really surprised if he goes deep into the games. We do have him projected relatively well per his ownership. We have him with a 21% chance to be a top 2 pitcher, 10.5% ownership share. But I'm not planning on having him on player pool just because of pitch count concerns. If you give him 60 pitches, does that still does that warrant him getting any exposure for you?
The only argument I could really make in his favor would be that he's not projected for a lot of ownership because people do know about the pitch count. So if you roster him, I don't think it's so much that you're saying, I think Clayton Kershaw breaks the slate at 10,400 and he's someone you have to have with his score. I think it's more so you're saying, what if Rodriguez, Alcantara, Darvish, Manoah, what if these guys all struggle in their games and they all score like 10 points and then Kershaw goes out there and in 4 or 5 innings, scores 18 points. So like he could outscore those guys just because they're in risky spots and they pitch poorly. But I don't anticipate it being a spot where Kershaw himself puts up a big score. And typically for me, I end up avoiding those spots, even though he is low owned. The other issue is that I don't even think this is really that similar to, remember we had the Freddie Peralta game, or a couple of Freddie Peralta games recently, where it was like, I think he's not going to go very deep into this game, but I don't really know. And maybe he will, and he's low owned. Here, it's more of like, I'm pretty confident he's not going deep into this game. I don't really think there's that like outer tier where it's like, oh, I was wrong and he threw 90 pitches. I don't think that exists here.
No, I would be, to me, that's like a sub like 0.1% outcome. Right. If we just see Kershaw, no kind of restriction. So great matchup for him against Arizona. I certainly don't want to stack the Diamondbacks against him, but I don't think I'm going to be getting to Kershaw. In the high end of the pricing tier, the player who the field is getting to the most often right now is Eduardo Rodriguez. There's a bunch of guys that are grouped fairly close in ownership at the top: Adam Wainwright, Alek Manoah, Sandy Alcantara, and Yu Darvish. But then we have Eduardo Rodriguez picking up almost double the ownership of all these guys. And there's been a lot of times we've discussed Eduardo Rodriguez in the second half of the season about how unlucky he's gotten. He has a 5.15 ERA, but a 3.67 expected ERA, a 3.54 FIP. He has a career best strike rate, a career best strikeout rate, career best walk rate. But that hasn't really contributed to run prevention. And as much as we've kept talking about how he's just had bad luck and he's going to regress to the mean soon, I know that in the YouTube chat, people this morning were telling me they're tired of me saying that about Eduardo Rodriguez. The season's almost over and it's never happened. And, point taken, but I still have to look at the numbers and think that this is a good spot for Eduardo Rodriguez. The question to me just becomes, do you think he warrants the kind of ownership he's picking up?
Yes and no. I think he does, because I feel better about him than really any of these other top end pitchers. He's $800 less than Alcantara. Alcantara has his own issues, even though he has been good overall this year. We'll get into that. There's reasons to think, maybe he struggles here, or at least doesn't have his best game. But either way, he's more expensive. Darvish, we've already talked about it. I'm not even really concerned about Darvish himself, but he is facing the Giants. That's clearly a very difficult matchup, both in terms of limiting production and getting strikeouts. Kershaw, we know the issues. Manoah has a high upside matchup, but he could just get blown to pieces as well. Like, it's a really, really dangerous spot against Tampa. And Wainwright, kind of just a middle of the road guy in terms of strikeout percentage. So Rodriguez is cheaper than all of those guys except Manoah on DraftKings, and he gets a park upgrade in terms of limiting power. He gets out of Fenway, where we've seen him give up more home runs this year, which isn't surprising, especially when you look at his expected power numbers to righties compared to his actual. I don't think it's very surprising that you're seeing him run pretty bad in terms of power. He's allowed a 170 ISO to right-handed hitters this year, only a 126 expected ISO. Not too surprising when he's playing with a wall 300 feet away or 310 feet away in left field. Tend to get kind of unlucky there. So I think it's a park upgrade for him. There are strikeouts in the Seattle lineup. They still have nearly a 4 implied run total. So there is still some risk here, but I think Rodriguez does deserve to be the highest owned out of the group. The reason I say yes and no is that it's still, in tournaments, if he's going to pull 36% ownership and Alcantara is only going to pull 17 and Darvish is only going to pull 20, I still think that relative to those pitchers, there's a bigger gap there than there really should be, because I think they are all still pretty similar. Even if Rodriguez is my preferred option, it's not by a wide margin. It's more so, I think he's the best of the group. If they're all owned the same, I would go to Rodriguez, but it's reflected in the top 2 pitchers tool right now. Darvish at 24.5%, Alcantara at 22.1, Rodriguez at 22. You can say what you want. You can flip those numbers a little bit to whatever you want them to be, but they're more or less the same. It's kind of like, we talked about with football yesterday, where Kyle Pitts is the best tight end in terms of projection, but there's a bunch of guys that are like 1 point behind him. So you can certainly get away from the field, especially if you have more popular bats, get away from Rodriguez and go to one of these other guys because they give you the same ceiling, even if they project a little bit worse.
Yeah, and the other thing too here with Rodriguez in the spot against Seattle, I'll add that I think if you're playing cash games, you start with Eduardo Rodriguez. I think that's fairly simple to say that he's the first pitcher you go to in cash. I'd play him in FanDuel cash also. But who would be your second starting pitcher to go to in the DK cash game?
I haven't built a lineup, so it kind of depends. Like, I really don't mind going to Espino if I can do something with the savings, just because he is getting 20% ownership on DraftKings right now. He's really cheap. He's facing Miami. I don't feel great about any of the top end pitching here. I don't mind just kind of punting the position and getting bats in. If not, then I think, maybe looking to Darvish in San Francisco and kind of just hoping for the best, because I do still think he's a little bit underpriced. But I don't really have a strong preference on the SP2. I agree Rodriguez is the first guy in. I wouldn't mind Wainwright. I wouldn't mind Darvish. I really wouldn't mind Alcantara. Kind of just whatever fits. But I think Espino, in terms of points per dollar, is the guy. So I would kind of start with him. And then if I'm just spending up for no reason on bats, then you can move up to somebody that projects, to score a little bit better, like Wainwright, Alcantara, or Darvish. But we do have Darvish as the top raw scoring pitcher. So I think if the salary doesn't matter, I'd go Darvish, hope for the best. If it does matter, then I think just punting the position with Espino is fine.
Let's have the Espino conversation now for tournaments, since we just talked about it, and then we can get to other guys like Manoah and Wainwright and whatnot. But first of all, everybody, I encourage you, go over to Paolo Espino's Fangraphs page. It reads like a CVS receipt. It goes on forever. He has pitched in so many different minor league organizations and so many different levels. And by the way, fairly unsuccessful at most of them. But he has been pitching in the major leagues. He's made a total of 18 starts in his career, but he's 34 years old. He's been in the minor league since 2007. So there is just a wealth of minor league data here, and most of it fairly unimpressive for Espino. His numbers this year haven't been good at the big league level, but it's not like they've been terrible either. He has a 4.81 expected ERA, a 4.38 FIP. There's no real fantasy upside here with a 20.4% strikeout rate. He does carry a low walk rate. But to me, I think the key with Espino is if you're looking to save salary, I just don't think there's anybody else who's really that reasonable of an option. Logan Gilbert is fairly popular at 6,700 in a really difficult matchup against Boston. Then I look at some of these other guys like, Spencer Howard, Dominic Leone, Colin McHugh is 8,100 as a relief pitcher, is going to throw like 2 innings. So you just kind of land on Espino by default, and you look at our projections, 20.2% ownership seems aggressive for Espino. We have one of the 18.1% chance to be a top 2 scoring pitcher on the slate. He's a 38% chance to be a top 2 value pitcher on the slate. As dumb as it sounds, he's kind of a priority play today.
Yeah. I was one thing that I was really curious about when I wrote the deep dive was sort of what would happen with the ownership between Gilbert and Espino as the day went on, because I think Gilbert is clearly the more talented of the two pitchers. I think Espino clearly has the better matchup. I don't have a really strong take between the two because, again, I have no issue betting on low-owned talent. I have no issue betting on a low-owned guy against the Marlins. But right now they're getting about the same ownership. And in that case, I would rather go to the cheaper one facing the Marlins. One other thing to point out, and I've already said before, I think Espino is one of the worst regular starting pitchers in baseball, but he has made some improvements recently. Over his last 5 starts, he has a 27% strikeout percentage. Not saying I think that continues, but if you look at his pitch mix over those starts, he has cut back on his fastball. He's throwing more sliders. He's throwing more curveballs. That is typically something that does lead to more strikeouts. When you see pitchers stop throwing fastballs and start throwing more breaking stuff, their DFS results typically do get better. So again, I'm not saying I think Espino is some new really good pitcher going forward, but I do think maybe there is a little bit more strikeout potential for him, especially in this matchup against Miami, than than you would think based on his season-long numbers.
Yeah, and once again, it's relative to the slate. It's relative to the other options we have here and price points. So even if you like Logan Gilbert more than him, there's a chance you might not be able to fit Logan Gilbert into your roster just based on the fact that Paolo Espino is $600 cheaper. Now, for FanDuel purposes, I certainly wouldn't consider Gilbert or Espino. This is just purely a price point play on DK. And if you're paying up for an offense, say like the Houston Astros are in a good spot today, there's a good chance you're going to need to save salary pitcher. And that's kind of where Espino makes sense. Because correct me if I'm wrong, I assume you don't have interest in guys like Dominic Leone or Spencer Howard.
Correct.
And that was also something somebody in the YouTube chat mentioned. Michael D said, what about Spencer Howard? So Spencer Howard, the length for him in recent starts, he has gone 2 innings, 2 innings, 3 innings, 2 1/3 innings, 3 2/3 innings, 3 innings, 2 1/3 innings. He just doesn't go deep enough into games to warrant any real significant upside. It's not to say Paolo Espino is a world beater, but it's just hard to find that much upside in a starting pitcher who's probably going to go 2 or 3 innings.
Yeah. If you're looking for a lower owned guy in that price range, the answer is Rich Hill compared to Gilbert and Espino. Not saying I like Hill not saying I like Hill as much as those guys, but right now we have Rich Hill at 7,100 projected for 7.5% ownership on DraftKings, Espino at 20% at 6,100, Gilbert at 24% at 6,700. Hill has thrown more pitches recently. He's thrown 83, 85, and 91 over his last 3 starts, going 5, 6, and 6 innings. It's not a great matchup against the Cardinals. He hasn't been great this year, but again, for the entire season, Espino hasn't been great either. Gilbert has a difficult matchup here. So I think if you were looking for a lower owned guy, Hill at least gives you that same ceiling, whereas Howard, you would need him to throw several more innings than we've seen Texas want to throw him. And then same for, Leone and McHugh.
Yeah, and McHugh, the price point is totally egregious on him, 8,100. I remember early in the day when I was talking with this slate, I thought that the price was listed wrong in our data at first. I was like, Colin McHugh for like min price. Maybe I'd consider him in a couple innings of the other option side. I was like, wait, he's 8,100. That makes no sense. So it's very rare that a player has a 0% chance of being a top 2 pitcher, and I totally agree with it. That is the case today with Colin McHugh, considering his price point and the kind of length we're going to be getting out of him. I'm going to ask you about one other guy in this, not the exact same price point, but at least in terms of low ownership that I think warrants some consideration today. Zach Gallen is only projected for 1% ownership. He has an 11.8% chance to be a top 2 scoring pitcher on the slate. The matchup against the Dodgers sucks. Like, there's obviously nothing we could say that's positive about that matchup. But something else about Zach Gallen is a conversation I think you and I have had 2 or 3, maybe even 4 times over the last couple of months. For whatever reason, the Vegas data does not seem to support Zach Gallen as a decent starting pitcher. And we've seen even bad teams go up against Zach Gallen and have an implied run total of like 5 runs against him. Yeah, I think Gallen's a fairly solid pitcher. He has a 3.67 expected ERA, 4.23 FIP, 26.8% K rate. So there's fantasy upside. Obviously, the matchup's no good. I just think he should be getting more than 1% ownership.
I agree, especially on a slate like this where, as we've said, there's question marks about pretty much every pitcher. The pitchers in good matchups aren't very good overall. The good pitchers are in tough matchups, sort of excluding Eduardo Rodriguez because his matchup's okay. But in general, there's just question marks about all of these guys. Slates like this, I really don't mind just betting on talent. And Zach Gallen has a higher strikeout percentage this year than every pitcher except for Darvish and Kershaw. Kershaw, obviously not really even in the conversation here. So, the matchup is tough, but it's tough for a lot of these guys. Gallen has a 26.8% strikeout percentage, 4.01 xFIP. And it's one of those spots where I think, he's going to struggle a relatively high percentage of the time, but the percentage of the time where he goes out there and has a good start is a lot higher than he's getting credit for. And because of his strikeout percentage, when he does go out and have a good start, those what those starts look like. There's some pitchers where it's like, oh yeah, if he pitches well, he probably still only struck out like 2 guys and he got a bunch of like lineouts to people. When Zach Gallen pitches well, he strikes out a lot of guys. He's got a really good changeup. He's got really good strikeout stuff. So I'm with you. It's not that he's as likely to have success as a lot of these other pitchers, but he's basically, if you look at the top 2 pitchers tool, it kind of gives you the picture. Darvish leads the slate at 24.5% chance of being a top 2 pitcher. Zach Gallen's at about 12%. So the difference between the number 1 pitcher in terms of being a top 2 pitcher and Zach Gallen is basically 2-1. And Zach Gallen is getting like 20-1 ownership versus almost every reasonable pitcher on this slate.
Yeah, and that's really what it comes down to, is just its ownership. This is a slate where it's kind of hard to differentiate. A lot of these plays look fairly similar in terms of those guys. Darvish, Sandy Alcantara, Alek Manoah, Adam Wainwright. A lot of these guys have similar ownership, similar odds of being a top 2 pitcher. We just have one guy in Zach Gallen who was 12x his chance of being a top 2 pitcher relative to our current projected ownership. So that's something where if you're really looking to be contrarian on this slate, and then also let me refresh the top stacks tool to see if this is still the case. Yeah, the Dodgers are way overowned in my opinion. So you're also getting a little bit of leverage there, which goes hand in hand. If I think that a lot of data suggests that Zach Gallen is being underrated, and then that also is leading to a lot of people on the Dodgers. We have the Dodgers right now projected for 14.3% ownership share with a 10% chance to be a top stack. I like the leverage we're getting there too. The chance of success and the risk is very high, but these are kind of the decisions I think we need to make to be profitable over the long course of an MLB season.
Yeah, exactly. And it just goes back to, paying attention to the range of outcomes. I saw somebody in chat, or a couple people in chat, say that the only sport that they think projections matter for is NBA. That's not true at all. But there's more volatility in sports like baseball that are event driven, football where touchdowns matter. So you still want to pay attention to projections, but you need to put them in context and think about what they're actually telling you. And in a situation like this, whereas in basketball, if I don't know what the difference is right now actually between Gallen and some of these other guys, but let's say there's a 5-point. So we have Zach Gallen on DraftKings at 14 points. We have Darvish at 18.5. In basketball, that would be a pretty big difference, in a lot of cases. But in baseball, that's kind of just saying that, yeah, on average, Darvish is going to do better, but a pretty high percentage of the time, Gallen is still going to beat him. And so that's why using things like the top pitchers tool, top stacks tool in conjunction with projections makes a lot of sense. And, it's important in every sport, but even more so in sports like baseball that are event driven and have a lot of volatility. So like projections still matter. You just have to keep in mind what they're telling you, and that a player is going to diverge from their median projection much more often in a sport like baseball than in basketball.
You know what I think people get tripped up on is that I agree. The mean projection for baseball holds some, but not that much significance. I think what people get tripped up on is that they're not accurate on a day-to-day basis.
Right.
Is that they're accurate over the long course of time, but on an individual day, is Darvish going to score 18 fantasy points tonight? Almost certainly not. He's most likely going to be, quite a few fantasy points away from that, whereas they are a lot closer to the mean projection on basketball. And I think that's kind of what trips people up. That's also why I like the tools we have on the site, like the top pitcher tool, like the top stacks tool, because it's using some of those projections to calculate odds of pitchers' overall chance of success relative to the slate. And that's all part of projection. So I think it's kind of, it's just phrasing that I think kind of trips people up. But I wouldn't look at the mean projection of any one player as gospel, if that's what people in the YouTube chat are saying. But there's ways to use that data and make it relevant.
Right. Like I still think, like when we talk about we talk about total ownership of your lineup being more important than, of any one player. And so there's still, like, let's say I have a really low owned stack and I'm not worried about ownership anymore. If I'm choosing between, Darvish projected for 18 points or Gallen projected for 14 points, I'm going to lean towards Darvish, where the ownership doesn't matter, because on average, Darvish is just going to score more points. But you shouldn't be that worried about going from Darvish to Gallen, where you do need to save ownership, because there's the volatility is so high. There's so much variance in baseball that even that 4.5 point difference in projection, the lower projected guy is going to outscore the higher projected guy a pretty high percentage of the time.
Yeah, and that's also then talking about some of those range of outcomes and making that relevant to some of these high-end pitchers on the slate, where the 3 guys we haven't talked about yet, Sandy Alcantara, Alek Manoah, and Adam Wainwright. The reason I like Manoah the most of these 3 is because of his strikeout upside, where also he's a little bit cheaper at 8,500. But the other thing also, Sandy Alcantara, really good. Also, a favorable matchup for him against Washington, but he doesn't have the highest strikeout rate in the world. Same goes for Adam Wainwright, where the matchup against the Mets, although the matchup against the Mets is pretty difficult now, but I view that Alek Manoah as being a guy who is much more likely to have slate breaking type upside than those plays. So I view the range of outcomes for Manoah, I think, is the widest of those three, which also makes him the most appealing fantasy option.
I agree because Tampa Bay does strike out a lot. Wow, Brett Phillips is leading off. Hadn't seen that. This is a pretty weak Tampa lineup too. No Brandon Lau, no Rosarena, no Zanino, which is whatever. We know Franco's out. So yeah, this lineup's pretty bad too, which helps Manoah. I was going to say that I agree there's a lot of strikeout upside here, but also Tampa Bay has a lot of power. And so I had said in the deep dive article today that I thought this was a perfect situation where if Manoah's pulling ownership, you play a lot of Tampa Bay. If Tampa Bay's pulling ownership, you play a lot of Manoah. If neither one's pulling ownership, you play a lot of both. But seeing this Tampa Bay lineup, I do think the clear edge goes to Manoah just because, yeah, they can still do damage. You know, Brett Phillips does still have some power. Taylor Walls has some speed. Mejia's fine, whatever. But it's still a good lineup, but it's nowhere near as good as the normal Tampa Bay lineup. Like if you look at their numbers against right-handed pitching this year, and they have a 114 WRC plus, but that's not this lineup. So here I do, even though he's getting a lot of ownership, I do feel if I had to pick one side, I would lean Manoah just because I think this is a pretty watered down lineup.
Yeah, and by the way, we do have. I'm going to agree with you, agreeing with me, but I also wanted to mention that Arcafelza says Alexi on DK. I don't know this is the spot to go to him. I believe that he's expected to be the long reliever for the Rangers today behind Spencer Howard, but I still don't know that means we're getting any kind of extreme length out of him. Is he somebody that's making it into your lineups?
Okay. So DraftKings has Jordan Lyles as the projected long reliever, but then the blurb for AJ Alexi says that it's expected to be Alexi. So good job on that one, DraftKings. But at 6,700, I still have a tough time there because one, he's facing Houston. So this isn't a team that I really want to take pitchers against anyway. They don't strike out. They have a lot of good hitters. But two, it's not even like he's 4K. So let's say Howard goes 2 innings. Alexi goes, 4? Maybe 5. It's just hard for me to see how $6,700 really pays off there. I'd be more interested if he was like 4K or something like that.
Yeah, and I think also that there's going to be a lot of just results-based stuff here where people are like, hey, he's pitched 11 innings in the big leagues and allowed 0 runs. Not that anybody thinks that means he's going to maintain a 0 ERA, but I think that might lead people to think that he's some really good starting pitcher. And, it's hard for me to get past that Steamer hasn't projected for a 5.17 ERA the rest of the year, also combined with how good the Houston Astros offense is. And, Alexi did have some good numbers in the minor leagues, but appears to be very, very luck-based. In AAA this year, he has a 233 BABIP and a 98.4% strand rate. In AA this year, 232 BABIP and 93.1% strand rate. Those are incredibly unsustainable numbers. And, the strikeout stuff is there. But in general, Alexi looks like somebody who's, in all likelihood, not going to be a good big league pitcher. So non-considered prospect and 23 years old.
This is also kind of his major league debut because the only 2 games he's pitched so far were against the Rockies outside of Coors and the Angels, which are borderline major league teams.
Yeah, and I mean we've got people and users saying, "Hey, he hasn't looked bad." I agree. He's pitched 2 starts and he's given up 0 runs. He's certainly looked good from that extent. He's walking a lot of guys, 13.2% walk rate. The strikeouts, those are nice. If I have to give some consideration and say like here are the positives. He's always struck out guys in the minor leagues. He's striking out guys this year. I generally don't believe in it long term. I hate the matchup against Houston. And also, like what Adam said, we don't know how long he's pitching today or even at all. There's a chance he'll end up not entering the game. And he's 6,700. So that's also not a price point that's super appealing.
The price point's really the deal breaker for me. Like the matchup sucks. The fact that, maybe he doesn't even pitch. Maybe he only goes, 3 or 4 innings. That stuff's concerning as well. But if you slap a 4K price tag on this guy, I'm willing to say, hey, pitching on the slate's pretty questionable. He's not going to get ownership. His strikeout numbers have been good in the minors. Maybe he does better than we expect against Houston. But at 6,700, it gets to that point where it's just like, what exactly does the game look like where you're really happy you rostered this guy? It's very easy to see what it looks like that when you're upset that you rostered him. Either he doesn't come in or he gets lit up by the Astros. But what exactly does it look like? He strikes out 8 Astros in 5 innings. Like, I guess he could, but that would be unbelievably unlikely, I think.
Yeah. And I mean, that's also something that, and I think we've covered all the pitchers. Anybody else you want to bring up? If not, we could transition to the offenses and we could talk about the Houston Astros.
We didn't talk about Odorizzi. I know someone mentioned him in chat. It's a really good matchup here against Texas. He is fairly priced on DraftKings at 7,600. He's only projected for 13% ownership. All of those things are good. My concern here is how deep does he go into this game? I don't know. If you wanted to get into narrative-based stuff, this is certainly, if you're someone that likes narrative-based stuff, this is certainly a spot for that, because we've seen him recently basically being pulled either after 5 innings or before he's able to complete the 6th. His splits, the third time through the order this year, have been absolutely terrible. He was pulled after 5 innings last start at 66 pitches, lost it in his post-game interview, said he thinks it's bullshit. He was taken out. He only threw 66 pitches. He was pitching well, blah, 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 blah. I don't know. Does Dusty Baker just say, okay, whatever, go, we'll see what happens? Or does Dusty Baker, just continue to do what he wants to do and get Odorizzi out before he goes 3 times through the order? At 7,600 against the Rangers, I think he can, even if he is pulled after 5 innings, he can do fine, especially given the question marks for everyone else on this slate. So I do like Odorizzi as long as the ownership's relatively low. But I think this is another spot where it's just like, how deep into this game is he going to go? Does Baker give him a longer leash, or, does he just keep doing what he's been doing?
The last time that he pitched 6 innings in the game was July 9th against the Yankees. He actually pitched okay in that game, but after that, they're like, we're never doing that again. So his recent starts, and it's not like he's coming out after 2 or 3 innings, but he's just very consistently being, to your point, he's coming out after 2 times through the order. So 5 innings, 5 innings, 5 innings, 5 2/3, 5 1/3, 5 innings. It's just hard to find all that much upside in that kind of length in the game, especially when the price point on him on DK, it's somewhat elevated. There's been some other spots where we were able to roster Odorizzi recently where he's been, 6,700, 6,500. That's not the case today. So to me, if you work him into some of your lineups, that's fine, but it's not like he's a priority play.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I'm at. I think the ownership is fine where he's at. Like, he's got he's getting less ownership than Gilbert. He's getting less than Espino. He's one of those guys where I think he pitches, or I don't even want to say that because he's not very good, but he's likely to pitch well for however long he's in the game. He's likely to go at least 5 innings if he's pitching well. There's a non-zero chance that he gets a little bit longer leash here. So I'm fine with Odorizzi with his ownership where it's at, but not a spot where I'm taking a crazy stand or anything either.
All right, so we'll transition over to the offense. If you guys have any questions about the offense, throw them into Slack chat, throw them into YouTube chat. But first, today's show is sponsored by Jock Market. If you guys aren't familiar with Jock Market, totally different way to play daily fantasy sports. It's really fun. There's an IPO period, and you're bidding on players as if they are stocks. So there's an IPO period, you bid on them, you try to get shares of players, and then after the games start, you could still buy and sell players. If somebody's performing really well to start, you could buy it. You could sell high on them. Somebody's off to a slow start and you think you're going to turn it around, you could buy low. So different way to play daily fantasy sports. Don't have to worry about any sort of lineup constructions or salary cap. And if you want to download the app right now and make a deposit, use the promo code Awesemo. That gets you a $50 bonus on your first deposit. Also, if you're maybe a little unsure about some of the stuff I just talked about, they also have free contests there. So you can download the app, play in some of the free contests, maybe win some money, or maybe get comfortable with it, decide you like it, and then you can make a deposit using that promo code Awesemo and get a $50 bonus on that first deposit. All right, so let's jump over to the offenses now. And I think where we have to start is with the Houston Astros, who by a pretty wide margin have our overall top stack odds today. And they're actually now under-owned on FanDuel. Earlier in the day, they were like nearly 20% projected ownership on FanDuel. They've come down to 14%. DK, we have them about appropriately owned. I'm going to refresh to make sure that's still the case. Slightly under-owned, 16.6% chance to be a top stack compared to 15.4% ownership share. To me, it's a lot of ownership, but I think it's very warranted in this spot.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's a good spot here against Texas. I think they're a good offense. And this slate's really weird because, kind of how we were talking about the pitchers to some extent, almost all of them having some sort of concern, whether it's matchup or talent. It's kind of the same thing with the offenses for the most part, because there are a lot of talented pitchers going on this slate. And a lot of the offenses that you would want to go to are facing the good pitchers. A lot of the offenses you don't really want to go to are facing the not as good pitchers. The exception is Houston, who is not facing very good pitching. They're also pretty cheap. So, on the one hand, yes, Alex Bregman's getting a ton of ownership at 26% on DraftKings. He's also $4,200. Alvarez, Tucker are priced up. Altuve's priced up. They're getting some ownership. But then, like Carlos Correa, 4,900, I think is reasonable. Jake Myers not getting much ownership. Yuli Gurriel, very expensive, not getting much ownership. So there's still ways that you can get to Houston, using Siri or Myers or Gurriel at lower ownership, or just using lower owned pitching. Like if you're going with the main part, 1 through 5 of the Astros lineup, that's the perfect spot to use somebody like Zach Gallen and discount ownership that way. So it is a really good spot. They're pulling a lot of ownership, but compared to some other teams, they're not really getting quite as much as they probably deserve.
Yeah, and that's the thing. There's a lot of teams we'll talk about with ownership, and I think a lot of people just assume that we think if a team's highly owned, it's a bad spot, and it's still relative to the odds of success, kind of like we were talking about some of the starting pitchers before. And we have the Houston Astros with the best odds being a top stack by a really wide margin. The team that's next closest to them in terms of top stack odds is the Los Angeles Dodgers. And we talked about before how Zach Allen looks like he's picking up no ownership as a pitcher and kind of makes him appealing. Also, Zach Allen's kind of decent. The Houston Astros, 16.6% chance to be a top stack compared to 10.8% for the Dodgers. But the difference here also, the ownership is the same between the two of them. So if you're going to one of these popular offenses, you just go to Houston, who has nearly double the odds of success here because the Dodgers look like one of the, if not the most over-owned teams on the slate. So how do you handle the Dodgers in tournaments given all the ownership going to them?
Yeah, and the other thing with Houston is they have the 4th highest top value percentage on DraftKings as well. So they're not only do they project to be the best team on the slate more often than anyone else, but they're going to allow you to get good pieces elsewhere in your lineup as well. So that's nice. Whereas you look at a team like the Dodgers, they don't offer as much value. They have a lower top stack percentage and they have similar ownership. So the Dodgers are definitely a team where if their ownership were to come down between now and lock, obviously, I'm not going to say, I don't want to go to the Dodgers here. I think Zach Allen is good. I don't think he's someone that I would shy away from a low-owned Dodger stack against. But with them getting ownership, when you compare them to the Astros, I think I would rather just be getting more Houston, less Dodgers, and then going to some of these teams that are projected to be under-owned that have, lower chances of success. But amongst the two teams at the top, I think Houston's getting less ownership than they deserve. The Dodgers are getting a bit more. Individually looking at the Dodgers bats, you do have several guys you can go to that are lower owned. Cody Bellinger, even though he's priced up, he's getting 6%. Taylor at 6%. Austin Barnes at 6%. So kind of like Houston, you do have guys you can look to that balance out that ownership. But the guys that you would really want, the Muncy, Seager, Betts, Turners of the world, are similarly owned to the guys that you would want on Houston. So I'm more inclined to just get to the Houston bets.
Yep, we totally agree there, which is not surprising because we're looking at some of the same data and we're going to agree on a lot of this stuff. But Dodgers certainly really popular and even more popular on FanDuel than they are on DK. We have Dodgers projected for 20.1% ownership on FanDuel compared to 14.4% as a team for Houston. So another spot where I think it really makes sense to get more exposure to Houston at the top end than the Dodgers. But now moving through some of these lower owned offenses, and maybe not totally unowned, but what do you make of the Tampa Bay Rays here? Because this is a team who we've had these spots where they've gone against some very good, also popular starting pitchers. And Alek Manoah, it's not like he's 40 or 50% on or anything like that, but he is one of the more popular pitchers today on DK and FanDuel. And we've seen the Tampa Bay Rays blow up a lot of good pitchers recently. And we've also seen on the other side, some very good pitchers have success against Tampa Bay Rays. So for instance, that series they recently had against the Red Sox, Chris Sale and Eduardo Rodriguez pitch against Tampa Bay. They scored double-digit runs against both of them. Then the next day after that, Nathan Eovaldi goes out and he scores like 30 fantasy points. So we've seen this wide range of outcomes that exist with Tampa Bay. They rate out as a little bit under-owned in our top stacks tool, but given that lineup that just came out and how weak it is, what do you think you're going to be doing with the Rays?
I still think I'll get there because, for one, there's a lot of pretty much outside of Houston, most offenses are pretty similar today. Two, Manoah does, he's got good strikeout stuff, but he's still a rookie. He still had his share of hiccups this season. And there is still a lot of power in the Tampa Bay lineup, even though it's not as strong a lineup as I would like. If it was their normal lineup, I'd be playing a lot of Tampa, no question about it. They'd also have a higher top stack percentage, I think. But even here, Brett Phillips, he strikes out a lot, but he has a 106 WRC plus, a 232 ISO against right-handed pitching since 2019. Mejia's got a 188 ISO, 95 WRC plus. Walls only has 95 plate appearances, but Meadows, Cruz, Choi, these guys all have power. Two ISOs over 200. Wendell's at 168 with a 115 WRC plus. This is still a dangerous lineup, even if it's not as good as it normally is. And they're not getting that much ownership. And on top of that, Manoah is likely to get ownership. So, like you were saying, this is just one of those teams where they have so much power in their lineup where if a pitcher is not on top of their game, they can take advantage in a big way. when they have a good game, they score a lot of fantasy points. Like their version of a good game isn't they slap a bunch of singles and some doubles and score 7 runs. It's they throw up, 12 runs in a hurry on home runs and doubles, and you kind of need them to win a tournament. So in a spot like this, I think it's a really good spot to get to Tampa. They're not getting a lot of ownership. Manoah is getting ownership. Like I said before, if I have to choose one side, which one I think is more likely to win out, I would go Manoah here against this particular lineup. But I think that the ceiling for both sides is extremely high, and Manoah is pulling quite a bit more ownership than Tampa Bay is.
So there's a point that you said there, which is a team that you often need to win a tournament. There's been no team more likely than that than the Toronto Blue Jays as of late. Who you think they're not going to do anything? They score 11 runs in an inning. Yesterday, they end up scoring, I think it was 22 runs they finished with. Another team, I think mostly because of price points, some of these guys are a little expensive. Only 8.2% projected ownership as a team on DK. Over on FanDuel, Toronto project for 5.9% ownership. Given all the success they've had recently and how good the quality of this offense is, I'm kind of surprised they're not picking up more offense in this spot. I think Toronto Blue Jays are another team to pay up for, not to necessarily be contrarian, but at least pay up for and be overweight to the field on them.
Yeah, agreed. Just another team that can put up a ton of runs. All you have to do is look back to what happened this weekend in Baltimore. I mean, they were being no hit through 6 innings in a 7-inning game and still scored 11 runs in that game. They scored 11 runs or 16 runs in that game or something. I don't remember. 11 runs in the first game of the doubleheader. They scored 22 yesterday. Not to say that that's predictive of what's going to happen today, but it just gives you an idea of when this team is facing a pitcher who is struggling, they have the type of power to just do so much damage in a hurry. Top to bottom, there's power in this lineup, excluding Breivik Valera, from Springer through Randall Grichuk. These guys all have power. Grichuk has struggled overall this year, but he's also only 2,800 on DraftKings. You're getting a bullpen game. It's not a super appealing matchup, but you are also getting Tampa Bay outside of Tropicana Field, which is nice. That's also something that makes me like the Tampa Bay offense, by the way. But yeah, it's just another spot where these teams give you very, very, very high ceilings on a slate where most offenses that you would actually want to go to have pretty legitimate question marks because they're facing tough pitching.
And talking about offenses that we normally wouldn't want to get to or would want to get to where they're facing tough pitching, we have the inverse situation here where this has to be the most ownership the Marlins have picked up the entire season. And by the way, another reason to like Paolo Espino as a GPP option today, the Marlins are insanely popular. And a lot of this is price point driven. But I still don't think that makes a whole lot of sense because what are we saving salary for on this slate? The pitching options that the field is generally rostering aren't that expensive. We have Eduardo Rodriguez's chalk at 8,800, which fine, it's not a cheap salary, but it's not like we need to save all the money in the world to get to him. It's not like he's Jacob deGrom or anything. Miami Marlins, 13% ownership with a 6.8% chance of being a top stack. They are massively over-owned on both FanDuel and DraftKings. How are you going to handle some of these guys? Because I do think they make for some good individual value plays. But as a total stack, it's just way too much ownership.
Yeah, agreed. I think that they project as very good point per dollar values. This is probably the first time all season that I've included 2 Marlins hitters in the deep dive. I had Jazz Chisholm in there. I had Jesus Sanchez in there. They're both good values, I think. Chisholm, one of the better second base options. Sanchez, 3K batting cleanup. Brian De La Cruz, 2,900 batting third. Lewis Brinson is free. This lineup is really, really cheap. And they're in a spot where Espino, overall this year has struggled, even though he's been good lately. But on top of that, he doesn't go super deep in the games usually. And Washington's bullpen will give up plenty of runs too. So it's a high upside spot for the Marlins, but they still have a 3.8 implied run total. Overall, they're not very good. And like you said, what exactly are you looking to pay up for on this slate? Like, I'm not saying that I don't want lineups that have like Sandy Alcantara plus Yu Darvish or Rodriguez or whatever. Like, yeah, there are pitchers to pay up for, but there's not pitching there's no like Jacob deGrom against the Rangers or something where I'm just like, I need this guy. There's no Corbin Burns on the slate. So I kind of view the top end pitching more as a luxury where, if I can get to both of them, that's cool, but I don't really want to be using popular Marlins bats to do it, especially because they are popular. I was thinking earlier in the day that Espino might get more ownership and that as a result, the Marlins wouldn't get that much. And in that case, I would really like Miami in tournaments. But right now with Espino's ownership being reasonable and Miami getting a lot, I'm more inclined to just play Espino. Certainly can use, some of these one-offs or mini stacks where you're not playing Espino. I do think that they're good values, but I would anticipate not having as much Miami as we have the field projected to have right now.
So the other thing too is just when I'm looking through the Marlins stacks that have popped up in my crunches that I don't particularly think are good lineups, they're either leaving a bunch of salary on the table or they're rostering Clayton Kershaw, who neither of us really liked as a pitching option. So that's also the point where it's like, all right, this lineup that I have right here, I'm looking at left $1,200 on the table, and it still is Clayton Kershaw at pitcher. It's just a crappy lineup, and that's kind of what I think a lot of these Marlins lineups look like. So I don't find them to be a very appealing stack in terms of one-offs. Sure, if you want to get to some of these guys here and there, particularly in cash games, it makes sense, but there's no refuge from the ownership. Everybody is super popular here. We have Isaiah. Let me look. I think it was. Isaiah Diaz is 5% owned. Every single other player in this lineup is over 12%. And that just doesn't really make sense considering the quality of these players.
Yeah, agreed. We talk about it a lot where popular plays in baseball in general, you kind of don't go wrong by, not playing them, but especially when they're not good, when the only reason a team is getting ownership is because of their median point per dollar projection. Typically it's a good spot to stay away from.
Yeah. And once again, it's just think of it in just overall context. Like Eric Johnson posting this in the YouTube chat, it was like, oh shit, the Marlins are chalk. Like, yeah, that should be the reaction. It's weird when the Marlins are chalk. It's not something that ever happens. There's a reason it doesn't usually happen. And, I think there are other offenses that we could get to either for cheap that makes sense or just for leverage purposes. And I mean, looking at some of these teams that positively correlate down the or positively leverage towards the bottom. What do you make of the Seattle Mariners? Because Erod, as much as I think he is an overall good pitcher, Sean V disagrees in the YouTube chat. I'm going to guess it's because of I'm going to guess it's because of his ERA. However, he's going to be popular. The Mariners are only project for 1.6% ownership. If we're going totally off the board in large field GPPs, I do think they're appealing for that option. We do have them as one of the more positively leveraged stacks of the day.
Yeah. Excuse me.
Oh, I got really choked up about Erod.
Yeah. Quick aside before that, I just wanted to make sure that Sean V saw how many strikeouts Ian Anderson had in his last start, and B saw how many innings Julio Urias threw in that start. Hadn't done a show since Friday when Sean V said that Ian Anderson not striking anyone out in 2 starts was a huge deal and you couldn't play him against the Marlins, and that the Dodgers were intentionally limiting Julio Urias to 5 innings. So wanted to point both of those out. But anyway, back to the Mariners. I don't like them, but I agree that with Rodriguez getting as much ownership as he is, they do make some sense in larger field tournaments. I think I'm more inclined to kind of just try and get like 1 or 2 hitters against him for power upside. Rodriguez has actually allowed more power to lefties than righties this year, which is, I think, particularly noteworthy when you're going up against Kyle Seager, who for years has put up good numbers against left-handed pitching. 187 expected ISO this year against left-handed pitching. Rodriguez has allowed a 215 expected ISO, 318 expected WOBA. His strikeout numbers are better against lefties at almost 33%, but that has been the side of the platoon that has done more damage offensively. So I like Seager. I pretty much always like Mitch Haniger. Those 2 guys, I think, stand out as pretty good one-offs.
Yeah. And by the way, Jordan in the YouTube chat, first of all, yes, people should like and subscribe to the YouTube channel, but there is no amount of likes that is going to get me to eat chalk on this channel because I'm not an idiot like Eric Lindquist. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, but no, I will not be eating chalk. We could get 1 million likes on this video, and I guess if we get 1 million likes, Eric will probably eat chalk again, but not me. I'll gladly volunteer Eric to do dumb stunts. But in terms of the Mariners, not a high probability stack. However, they have lower ownership than these other low probability stacks. We have teams like the Mets, the Nationals, the Rangers, the Diamondbacks. These are all teams with comparable top stack odds to Seattle. But these are teams that are like 3 to 4% owned compared to 1.6% for Seattle. So do any of these other really low probability stacks stand out to you at all?
Not in the sense of like, I think that they're really likely to be successful. I think Seattle of the low owned stacks, I think Seattle and the Giants would be my 2 favorites, just because, Seattle, you're getting negative correlation with a very popular Eduardo Rodriguez. The Giants have a tough matchup against Darvish, but even over the course of the entire season, he has had some home run issues. And on top of that, the Giants are priced down for this matchup. So they're a team where I think for all intents and purposes, you can probably do whatever you want. Like whatever people are doing with the Marlins, like whatever they're using that savings for, I think pretty much you can do the same thing with the Giants. They're cheap enough, with the exception, Chris Bryant's 5,100, Crawford's 4,400. So he's basically priced the same as Chisholm. But La Stella, 2,500, Belt's discounted to 3,800, Wade's at 3,100, Yastrzemski's at 3,500. This team's really, really cheap for how good they are, not getting much ownership. You can build some really good teams. Like if you did want to pay up for pitching, Alcantara, Wainwright, any of those guys at the top. The Giants, I think, are an actual good team that's cheap and a lot lower owned than someone like Miami.
Yeah, and the other thing too with the Giants is, I mean, when we talk about the some of the home run struggles that Darvish said recently, and to your point, his expected WOBA is certainly lower than what his actual WOBA is, but it's still, the Giants have a very good offense, and Darvish, there is reason to think he's been an extremely inconsistent pitcher over the course of his career. I do think there is some reason to still go to them as a stack, although they've also come up a little bit in ownership versus this morning. I think this morning they were projected for like 2% ownership. Now they're 5.6, which looks about appropriate. So I don't have an issue getting to them, although not a high priority play. One last team that I want to ask you about, and then that'll just about take us to the end of the show, but you guys shouldn't be going anywhere because we do have plenty of football content coming up. There's the NFL Deeper Dive, NFL Live Before Lock for the Showdown slate, but the St. Louis Cardinals are projected to be a very popular offense, and I get they have a right-hand dominant lineup with some power, and they're going up against a left-hand pitcher in Rich Hill. But Rich Hill has started to get stretched out and is pitching better for the Mets. So do you think that the Cardinals warrant as much ownership as they're getting?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an okay matchup. It's one of these spots where if the Cardinals weren't getting ownership, I would say that I thought they were a decent tournament option because they do have a lot of power in their lineup. But with the ownership they're getting, I think it's coming in a bit higher than it probably should. Rich Hill is, to me, just a guy. He's not a great pitcher, but 185 expected ISO, 22% strikeout percentage, 332 expected WOBA to right-handed hitters this year. Not someone that I would shy away from targeting at low ownership, but with the ownership being where it's at, I think I get to some other teams first. I do think Paul Goldschmidt at 4,500 is a good value. I think Arenado at 4,800 is a solid play. Carlson's only 3,100. O'Neill's 4,400. Those guys individually are all good plays, but I think that it's just there's a lot of teams with similar chances of success to the Cardinals that are getting less ownership that I'd be more inclined to go to.
Yeah, and that's really where I'm at with this team. Also, they're just too popular. Like you said, Arenado, Goldschmidt would all be fine individually plays, but I do think that they're picking up a little bit too much ownership. By the way, everybody talking about what Eric would do for likes, like the 3 likes on YouTube and he'll sell his kidneys. Like the bar is very low what he'll do for attention. It's don't put me in that boat of how many likes we need for me to eat chalk, because it's not happening. But any other offense or individual hitters that you want to talk about?
No, I think we pretty much covered it.
All right, so that is going to do it for us today. Thank you to JockMarket for sponsoring the show. If you guys want to test out JockMarket, download the app. Use the promo code Awesemo, make your first deposit, get up to a $50 bonus. Besides that, good luck today, guys.